Hello, Verna.
Hi, thank you very, very much. I appreciate this. My question is, first of all, let me preface by saying I'm a recent convert to I've recently become Catholic and getting more and more plugged in and involved.
Great. Welcome home, Verna.
Thank you. And one of the things is EWTN TV and Catholic Radio and the journey home on the Catholic TV too. All of these things are just, I love it.
Right on.
Thank you. So I do have one of those challenging issues, though, and I've pretty much settled on everything that I had questions about beforehand, and I'm really grateful to the Scott Hahn Ministry and stuff, too, for that. But I do have one issue that still kind of plagues me, and that is the absolute requirement for celibacy for priests and religious people. And I also was partly raised in a tradition that was what we call apostolic, but one of the Eastern churches that is not under Rome. And the priests there, as in the Orthodox churches, obviously have a choice before becoming ordained to marry or not to marry, and if they're truly called the celibate life, then to go on in that way, and they can go up.
Can it be summarized this way? Why doesn't the Church offer in the Latin Rite an option to marry for her clergy? Is that the gist?
Correct. And okay. I think you'd have a lot less problems with clergy, and I think you probably would have more people becoming clergy as well.
Very well stated, Verna. Is that true, Tim? What's digging?
Yeah, and Verna, I'm glad that you pointed out there that in the East we do have married clergy, and we also have in the Western Rite married clergy as well. It usually happens with converts. In fact, we had Father Ray Ryland right here at Catholic Answers, who was an Anglican convert who was a married priest. So you do have in both East and West. So the real question is, why do we have at all in the Church a situation where people, in order to become priests or transitional deacons, have to make that commitment? All right, so that's really the question. And Verna, I think the crux of the issue is the Church has always taken the recommendation of Jesus Christ in Matthew 19:12 and St. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Both of them recommended celibacy. And I would like to add that it is in both examples, both our Lord, it's in the context of him calling the apostles to leave everything and follow him, where he recommends celibacy. And then Peter, of course, responds, well, we're doing this. We're leaving everything. Right. And St. Paul, who explicitly there in 1 Corinthians 7, in the context of recommending celibacy, makes the point that the one who is married is concerned about things of the world, how to care for his wife and family, whereas the celibate is free to serve the Lord with simplicity, right? And so the context is the service of the Lord. And so what the Church has always done is we've taken those recommendations of both Jesus and St. Paul, and I can tell you this, I think it is, with all due respect, I think it is a mistake to think that the answer is doing away with celibacy, we'll get more people and so forth. I think historically what we've seen in the Church is celibacy has been a saint-making machine. I mean, the majority of saints are, in fact, celibates. I mean, you have Revelation chapter 7, Revelation 14 that talk about the 144,000 who have not been with women. You have, the fact that, again, we look over history, it's really not arguable that celibacy is anything other than what St. Paul describes it as in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 37 and 38. He says the one that marries does well, because marriage is holy and it is good. But the one who does not marry does better. What? How can he say that? Well, Pope John Paul II, picking up on that in Familiaris Consortio, paragraph 16, makes the point that celibacy is truly a more holy state because of the very reason that it is offering up, it is giving up something that is so good, namely marriage. And so my argument is, Verna, though theoretically we say that celibacy is an ecclesiastical tradition, and the church giveth, the church can take away. Theoretically, it could go away, but I would bet the house that it never will, because and I'd recommend a book by Father Coccini, a Jesuit priest, called The Apostolic Origins of Priestly Celibacy. It's the best thing I've ever seen on celibacy. It from a historical perspective, shows you how this was the norm from day one. It wasn't something that came along hundreds of years later. Contraire, this goes all the way back to Christ, this recommendation of celibacy here. But I would like to throw out a little anecdotal thing here. We live in an era where the problem is not, with celibacy. The problem is we live in a sexually crazed culture. We live in a culture of me, and this is the reason why, by the way, there's a shortage in vocations, not just in the Catholic Church, but in Episcopalianism, in Lutheranism, you name it. There is a problem with commitment in our culture. There is a problem with a sexually crazed culture, and I argue that celibacy is not the problem, it's the answer. Because we live in a culture that is so driven by me and is sexually crazed, that celibacy is we say in the church, an eschatological sign. It's a sign of the love of Christ for his church. Why? Because sex, we know, dies when we do. In eternity, as Jesus said in Luke 20, there will be neither marriage nor giving in marriage. Sex ends with this life, but love is eternal. And I think the celibate, this great gift to the church, is a sign for us of what love ultimately is in a culture that confuses sensuality and sexuality with love, as if you cannot have love without that sexual contact. And that is a tragedy, because of course the highest form of love is the love that God possesses for all eternity, and the love between the Father and the Son that is so infinitely perfect. It is a third person, and it is not sexual. The love of Christ for his church, greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay his life down for his friends. It is a non-sexual love. It's a love that gives without asking anything in return, and that is precisely what the celibate presents to us. And so, Verna, I say praise God for celibacy, and I'll leave you with, I need to just share this with you, Verna, and you probably already know this, but for our listeners, there's a great book, Priest and Pedophiles, by Dr. Philip Jenkins, whom we've had on this broadcast before. He's not a Catholic. He's a professor of history and religious studies at Penn State University, or at least he was. I think he's still there. And he wrote a book called Priests and Pedophiles, The Anatomy of a Crisis. And in that book, he demonstrates how that the problem with quote-unquote pedophilia, which really in many cases is a misnomer, while there have been problems with pedophilia, he cites one study, Patrick, in Chicago, a 40-year study where there was a total of about one case in those 40 years of true pedophilia. The real problem was ephebophilia, or just plain homosexuality. Ephebophilia meaning sexual contact between a man and an age who is a boy who has not reached the age of majority,
on the cusp of puberty, say, but not true child, not before that.
After puberty, but before the age of majority, before 18, is ephebophilia. This 40-year study had one, as Dr. Jenkins says in his books, were it not for this one sad case, the pedophilia crisis in Chicago would not have had a single case of pedophilia. The problem was actually homosexuality. And further, he points out that among Protestant clergy, the problem is almost 4 times worse. It's over 3 times worse, but the Catholics get all the airtime. And plus, we have to add that the majority of pedophilia happens between father and children. Are we going to do away with marriage because of this? I mean, there are so many misnomers that are thrown out there about celibacy. Well, celibacy is the problem, and if you do away with that, you're going to do away with problems. No, in fact, among the clergy that are married, the problem is worse. And so that tells you that the problem is cultural. It goes beyond these things that the media would have us believe are the actual sources. And I'll say this finally, Verna, and I know I'm spending a lot of time on this, but this is so important. I know as a former Protestant minister myself, I was a youth minister in the Assemblies of God. I saw more sexual problems, scandals among my brothers. And this is not to put anyone down here. I mean, I had a good friend, I remember, who ran off with his secretary. He's a wonderful man. He was a pastor at a church I was attending. He runs off with his secretary. I saw divorce, remarriage. I saw all sorts of, and in fact, Philip Jenkins points out in his book as well, he goes to case after case where you had two brothers, for example, in Detroit, Michigan, two Baptist brothers who abused over 100 boys. And this was in the 80s, the same time that Father Shanley and Father Gogan were, unfortunately became so infamous. But the story was picked up on the local wire there in Detroit, Michigan, but never on the national wire. You had a Pentecostal evangelist traveling up and down the southeastern United States, also abused a bunch of boys. Reported in Raleigh, North Carolina, but not on the national wire. What Jenkins points out is it's the Catholics got the airtime because, let's face it, folks, there is an anti-Catholic sentiment that has been here from the beginning of the United States, number one. And number two, he calls it the deep pocket syndrome. Why do you want to go after a Pentecostal evangelist that you can get a Volkswagen from when you can go after the Catholic Church and get millions and millions and millions of dollars? And I'll tell you, Verna, the thing that breaks my heart is being an Assembly of God minister and knowing. I remember my pastor, Pastor Gary, who was one of the most wonderful men I've ever known and a truly great Christian man. I'll never forget the day. He was my senior pastor when I was a youth pastor. And I'll never forget the day when he came to a staff meeting and he said, folks, you're not going to see me for a while. And the reason? His son, who, by the way, was the worst kid in my youth ministry, I wanted to strangle him often, but his son came to the secretary one day and signed up to have an appointment to talk to his father. And the reason, of course, now, again, this kid wasn't smart enough to do this for political reasons. He wasn't. He simply wanted to talk to his father. And his father was so busy with the church. That's what he had to do. And Pastor Gary came in and said, guys, you know what? I've been neglecting my family. You're not going to see me here for a while. But then, see, what happens is then the church family suffers because what you find is that you simply cannot give 100% to both your natural family and to the church family. And when you add the sacramental ministry that priests have, it's all the more impossible. There is tremendous wisdom to celibacy.
As Paul says in that same chapter, 1 Corinthians 7, the dividedness of the man who's trying to please the Lord and trying to please his wife. Verna, I know that's a lot. I want to give one last little caboose on the train here. Tim earlier mentioned Father Ray Ryland. His memoirs are now published. In the last chapter, the book is called Drawn from Shadows into Truth, a memoir by Father Ray Ryland, the father of our own magazine's fine editor, Tim Ryland. It's called Priestly Celibacy. That is the best, pithiest, most accurate summary of the early church, to say the first 500 years or so, the scriptural and the magisterial data on how well attested celibacy is and how it's not going away, and how even the Eastern tradition of married clergy was an accommodation on behalf of the church. So I highly recommend that book. I so thank you for the call, Verna. I hope it was a help. This is Catholic Answers Live. Tim Staples is the guest, and he'll be right back.